This is an interview with attorney Jerome Buddy Cooper for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. We're at Miles College, September 20, 1995. Thank you, Attorney Cooper, for coming out and sitting with us today to talk about the history of Birmingham. What we are attempting to do at the Institute, of course, develop histories that would lead us to understanding from whence Birmingham has come. So again, I want to thank you for coming out. And I just want to start with a few sort of general kinds of questions about background. Tell me, where were your parents from? Are they Alabamians?
No, well, I consider them Alabamians, but actually my mother was born in Poland and came to Birmingham when she was 3 months old. So when she died in her 90s, we considered her as being an early settler of Birmingham. My father was a little older than she. He was born in Lithuania and came to Birmingham when he was 13 years old, or came to this area, rather.
Okay, and where were you born?
In a little village called Brookwood in Tuscaloosa County.
Okay. Was Brookwood a coal mining area?
Yes, Brookwood was the site of some major coal mines, but it was also an agricultural area too. I remember one coal miner telling me one time when he testified before the United States Congress for getting legislation to help coal miners, he raised some questions about farming. And one opposed senator said, well, you're a coal miner, you wouldn't know anything about farming, would you? And he said, coal miners made so little working in the mines, we had to farm in order not to starve.
Yeah, you had to do both in order to make ends meet, I assume. Right. Yes. What was your father's occupation?
He was a merchant. He had operated, he and his brother, general store in Brookwood, another one in Searles, along with his brother-in-law, and one in Kellerman. Later, he was in the wholesale business in Birmingham.
Did your mother work outside of the home?
Yes, after the Depression, she did. She worked in my father's store.
Okay.
That was after the big collapse that took place in Birmingham,
right,
in this area, and this country.
Betty, do you remember the Depression, those Depression years?
Sure, I was in college before the Depression actually struck. I went to college in the fall of 1929, and that year was the big stock market crash, and then
right,
by 1932, when I was a junior, I mean, the whole country was flat.
Well, let's go back. Tell me just a bit then about those early days, where did you start elementary school, and where did you graduate from high school?
Well, we moved to Birmingham from Brookwood in 1919, and I started in grammar school, South Highland School, that year, either 1919 or 1920. I think I started in the middle of the year. And then I graduated from South Highland Grammar School and went to Phillips High School.
And you graduated from Phillips High School?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, your father moved, your family moved from Brookwood to Birmingham.
To Birmingham.
So your father was never a coal miner?
No.
He was always a merchant?
He was a merchant.
And then did he open stores here in Birmingham?
Before we moved to Birmingham, in fact, before I was born, he and his brother moved to Birmingham and opened one of the first department stores in downtown Birmingham.
What's the name of the store?
It was Cooper Brothers, just like everywhere they went, it was Cooper Brothers.
Where was it located?
It was located on 2nd Avenue between 20th and 19th Street, which building was later occupied by Burger Phillips, and it has recently been remodeled. I forget what it's for, but in 1907, I think it was, after that store had been operating for not a very long time, my father's brother, his partner, became ill and had to go to Johns Hopkins or somewhere, and a very serious panic type of depression set in, and so he just paid off all his debts and closed the store and went back to Brookwood. He didn't come back until 1919.
Okay. What part of town did you all live?
Well, at that time, of course, this was before I was born. My grandparents lived on the north side in 8th Avenue, somewhere in 15th Street, 16th Street.
In the vicinity of the Civil Rights Institute now?
Yes, just a couple of blocks, 2 or 3 blocks from it. And the house which my grandparents on my father's side occupied was standing until a few years ago. It's been torn down now.
And you grew up, though, on the south side?
On the south side, right, on 15th Avenue and 16th Street. Our house was 1601 15th Avenue South, which was right at the foot of Vulcan.
Okay. So then you graduated from Phillips High School, and did you go to the University of Alabama?
No, I did not.
Where did you
I went
go
to Harvard College.
Oh, you went to Harvard, in the Harvard College?
I went to the college.
How did a young fellow from Birmingham, Alabama, make that transition from Birmingham to Boston?
Well, it was a little awkward at times. I was a lost ball in the high weed, really. I was 16 years old, and I'd never been out of Alabama except once over the line to Chattanooga. But my father had a dedication to education and to learning. He had never had any formal education except what he had by going to parochial Hebrew school as a little boy. And I think this same lady, I think I talked to you today about Miss Clarabelle Sin, who taught me Latin at Phillips High School. So she had a part in interesting me in Harvard. And once my father heard about it and got to know what it really stood for, he was insistent, and so I went. It was pretty difficult to make the transition the first year.
Well, that meant that your family then was pretty well off, that you'd be able to go to
my father was quite well off at that time, and then that was before the stock market crash and the depreciation of values in real estate, which is where his funds were invested.
How did that, do you remember how that affected you and your family, the depression, I mean?
Oh, sure. Well, for one thing, my father had to go back to work 12 hours a day in a small retail store in Birmingham on 2nd Avenue. My mother went to work for $10 a week or thereabout. We didn't have an automobile even. After having driven big, fine cars, we rode the buses, or the streetcars still. I went to school the first year or two without much difficulty, but then by the end of my sophomore year, I told the dean, one of the deans, that I couldn't come back to Harvard. It just was, we were penniless. And he said, well, there are many scholarships available. You have to make scholarship grades. If you do that, we don't want anybody to have to lose out here for just because he is financially unable to pay. So I buckled down and was fortunate enough to get a scholarship. Incidentally, they gave me a scholarship when I registered as a freshman, but I hadn't sought one. And when I showed it to my father, he asked me, what was this all about? I said, I don't know. I think it was part of their program to maintain a national distribution in the student body. But he said, we don't need that. Give it back. He said, that might keep some boy who really needs it from coming. So we gave it back, and they gave me a little piece of paper instead, which was fine. But two years later, after his fortune had collapsed, as I said, I told him I couldn't come back, and I got a scholarship, and by means of that,
that's the way you continued your education.
that's the way I continued. Now I didn't come home. I went to Cambridge in September and came back in June.
So you didn't come home for Christmas?
I didn't come home every weekend like
any-
kids do now, or even for Christmas.
For Hanukkah.
It cost money.
Well, buddy, were you an only child?
No, I have a sister. I had a sister, my older sister.
She's older than you were.
Yes.
So was she off in college at the
Yes,
same time?
That's right. Well, she was ahead of me 2 years, so she got out before the collapse was on the way, but she actually got out before it had hit full bloom. Yeah.
Okay, so then you would have graduated from Harvard in what, 33?
1933.
And what did you do after that, after graduation?
Well, I couldn't get a job, of course. I tried to help my father in his store.
You came back
I
to
came
Birmingham?
back and spent the summer here. I remember I did a lot of reading in the store, and my father one day said to me, "Now, this is not a library, but he said, I'm glad you want to read. If you want to, you go to the library, but not here." I said, "Well, I didn't see anything to do. There were no customers or anything." He said, "Well, work the stock."
So how long did you work with your father? Was it just for that summer?
Just in the summer,
Okay.
yeah. I could do a little typing for him. He no longer had a secretary or anything like that, and I could help him.
Okay. In the fall, then, what did you
I
do?
went back to law school. After I graduated, I went back to law school in Cambridge.
Back to Harvard.
Harvard, right.
So
I got a scholarship there.
And you graduated from Harvard Law School.
That's right. Incidentally, I wasn't a football player, and I was a fair tennis player, but I had to get the grades to get my scholarship, and I've always had a strange reaction to these stories about scholarship holders in college these days who are scholarship only in the sense that they get money from the university, but they're hardly scholars.
Well,
Some of them are. There are a few, of course.
Yeah, well, there are some, but the whole idea of scholarship is probably changed since that
Well,
time.
it's a misnomer. I
Yes.
think they ought to just call them paid athletes or
Do
something.
you think they should pay them?
I would have no objection to that if it was done openly.
Well,
You know,
because some are paid, I assume.
yeah, but it's illegal and
Sure.
improper.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it would work even if it was legal,
Yeah.
Horace, because there are professional leagues where people can go and work as athletes if they have the ability.
Right. Well, Buddy, after you finish law school, what does Buddy Cooper do?
Well, I was recommended by the dean of Harvard Law School, who was then Roscoe Pound, famous figure up there, and I was appointed law clerk to, it was really secretary, but they didn't call us law clerks then. David J. Davis, Judge David J. Davis, who was the United States District Judge for the Northern District of Alabama. We only had one federal judge in the whole north of Alabama then. And I worked with him for not quite a year, just about a year. And he was a grand man and a wonderful fellow. He was from somewhere up in North Alabama, from a farm, but he had worked his way through Exeter or one of those New England secondary schools as a boy. He actually rode in a covered wagon from Wedowee, I think it was. I think it's the same town that's been in the news so much, to Oklahoma. His family and his father, they went in a covered wagon from Alabama to Oklahoma and homesteaded a farm and did fairly well for a year or two, but they had a bad crop or something, and they came back, and he went through this secondary school and then directly to Yale Law School. I don't think he went to college. he got a scholarship to Yale Law School, was on the Law Journal, and he wrote, for a district judge, he handled some very important things. He wrote an opinion and judgment sustaining the Social Security Act, for example, which started in a lawsuit here in the Northern District of Alabama.
Well, Buddy, what role did race play in your life up to that point? You've come out of law school. You had lived in Birmingham for those years.
Well, Birmingham was still a frontier town, really, in terms of sociology and race. Everything was segregated, so that we had some dear people, like the black lady who was our nurse in our house.
In your home.
In our home, who came with us from Brookwood and lived with us.
She didn't have a family?
I think she did, but I think they stayed in Brookwood. I think she was quite elderly, and that's my best guess. And I think her children had married, but we were small. My sister and I, we were little kids. I was 6 or 7 years old, and she was 7 or 8 years old. And this lady, it's kind of humorous when I think back, although it's a sign of the tragic way people had to live then. She would take us on a picnic from the south side. My mother would fix a big basket, and she would take the two of us, and we'd get on the streetcar there on the south side and come to town and transfer, take the Tidewater line out to Avondale Park and spend the day. They had an elephant there, Miss Fancy, and a few other little animals in a pond, fish. Then we'd retrace our steps, but on the streetcar, we sat in the white section, and she sat with us. And once or twice, the white motorman, I don't remember, it's so long ago, but he evidently remonstrated, and she told him where to go. These were we were her children.
So she actually sat in the
She
front
actually
of
sat wherever we sat, and that's wherever we found a seat, yeah.
And she was never arrested. There was
there was no
commotion
scene about it or anything. You know, it didn't happen very often.
So, were those your first memories of race playing a part in your life?
Yes, I remember her as she worked for my mother in Brookwood, but I just remember that she was there. I don't remember. I have no real impressions about it, but for instance, one of the earliest things I can recall instruction-wise was my father and I loved to walk together on Sundays. And we were out walking one day, and I don't remember how the subject came up, but I said something about someone having, I was quoting someone, it wasn't my language, but who used the word nigger. And my father said to me that nice people don't use that word. And I said, well, what am I supposed to say? And he said, you say colored people. Well, now of course, it's assumed another form. I understand some black people don't care whether it's colored or black, but other people are very sensitive about it.
Right.
But I remember, and I never forgot that. Nice people don't
use that term.
That's right, and he never did. I don't ever recall.
Yeah. As you grew up, when you were at Phillips High School, for instance, were there any incidents in your memory where race may have played a role?
No, because there were none. There were no black kids there. It was the one incident that I can recall. I've always been a sort of frustrated politician, and I'm glad I was frustrated in most instances, but I ran for the secretary of the student body, and it was a big political...
This is at Phillips?
At Phillips thing, right. I don't remember how many kids there were, 1,500 or 2,000. It was a big school.
Right.
And the political campaign was one of the big events of the year. And one of my campaigners came up to me one day and said, "Buddy, so-and-so has put out the word that you're Jewish." And I said, "Well, I am." He said, "You are." But I won anyway. I beat a very prominent, very fine lady from a very distinguished social family in Birmingham.
There were no other incidents as a result of your being Jewish and the student body finding that out?
I don't recall any. I do recall having a couple of scrapes. Well, you see, I never objected to someone referring to me as being Jewish. I'm backslid Jewish philosophically, but I don't. It depends on the circumstances. If someone said to me, "You Jew," I might dislike that. I might have taken them on. But if someone just said, "I understand you're Jewish," well, I am. I mean, just as if someone would say to you, "Well, you happen to be black," you'd say, "Well, yes, I am." But if someone said, "You black so-and-so," you'd have a different reaction.
Sure.
I know. We had our problems.
Right. You went into the military. Was that during World War II?
Yeah, it was in World War II. I enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, December 9th, 1941. Right.
And how long did you spend in the military?
44 months. The Navy. I went into the Army as a private and stayed a very short time, and things were in such a hectic mess. They hadn't changed the rules from peacetime to wartime. It was a horrible. This thing fell on us, and so after I had passed my physical by bribing a sergeant who knew I couldn't pass the eye test. I got his help, and he said, "Yeah, sure, I'll get you by." And they told me they couldn't keep me in the Army because I had dependents or something, and they hadn't provided for that.
You were married at the time?
Yeah, I was married and had a kid.
Okay.
And another one on the way. It was a cruel thing I did in a way to my wife and kids, but I would do it again. Because while I was raised a pacifist, I had decided from what I knew then that I didn't want to live in a world run by Adolf Hitler.
Yeah. So you spent 44 months in the military, and after the military, you came back to Birmingham.
See, I had a short period from law school, I went with Judge Davis, and then I went to Washington with Justice Black.
That's right.
We kind of skipped that.
That's right. Tell me about that.
Well, he was a former law partner of Judge Davis. So he knew about me through Judge Davis, I take it, and other people, I guess, that he knew in Birmingham. And when he was appointed to the Supreme Court, he had someone call my father, called me at the federal court where I was working, said that Judge Black wanted me to come to Washington and be his law clerk. Frequently it happens that a law clerk from a Court of Appeals judge or a district judge will be elevated. I mean, that was not unusual, I don't think. And of course, my heart stopped beating when he called me in, the judge called me in the office and told me that. And I said, I'll have to ask my father. So the judge laughed and said into the phone, he wants to talk to his daddy first. So I ran up to my daddy's store and I told him this wonderful call had come. And he thought a minute and he said, well, let me tell you something, Jay. It so happened, see, my judge that I worked for then had taken the place of a judge who'd been sick for a year or more. And the cases had piled up, and he and I both were working day and night. He said, you go back and tell Judge Davis that that you won't take that job if it will in any way inconvenience him, and that you want to do whatever is in his best interest first. That was a pretty remarkable thing for him to say as I look back on. So I went back and I told the judge that, and he laughed and he said, I've got 100 applications, or something like that. I've got a lot of good boys.
What do you remember most? What stands out in your mind most about clerking for Hugo Black?
Well, there are a number of things, really. I remember the first day. I remember very sharply the first day, or one of the first days, when I met him. I went to Washington and met him. He was a very warm, genial man, and of course, one of my heroes. I confess to an honest bias about him. He is one of the great miracles of my lifetime.
Why do you look on him as one of those great miracles of your lifetime?
Well, for this very simple reason. People ask me, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, which was a problem that many people saw. He would have had difficulty, if not an impossibility, of being elected in those times without Klan support, because everybody was in the Klan. That is, the judges, the governor, the senators. Not all, but virtually everybody was. A lot of people were. Senator Bankhead wasn't, I don't think.
As a political necessity?
Yeah, just as a political necessity. But he's a miracle. I can't explain how a man born into slavery almost, he lived on the frontier of Alabama in a slave culture. There'd been no freedom of the blacks. Technically they were no longer slaves, but the way they lived, the opportunities for them were still terribly, terribly limited. Now, how did it happen that this person born in that atmosphere, in that culture, had within him somehow the seeds of this international vision, this concept of mankind, of all men being able to walk erect, all men and women to live in freedom? How did that come about? It didn't happen to his brother. It didn't happen to the neighbor next door. It wasn't in his father. It's just a miracle. It just happened. I can't explain it. All the historians, psychologists have got all kind of reasons.
Sure. Yeah, people are always attempting to explain how, in fact, he in the 1920s could be a member of the Ku Klux Klan and then eventually making it to the Supreme Court and being one of those pivotal justices in creating what eventually would happen in the country.
I often say to people who there were a lot of people who got ugly about that Klan business. What are you doing, with the judge who was in? And I'd say to them, well, I'm sorry he was a member of the Klan. I don't try to defend the Klan in any way. It's contrary to all of my inner instincts. But one thing I am grateful for, no one ever intimated that Hugo Black ever participated in any of the atrocities, the terrible things that the Klan did. He made speeches and went to their meetings and got their votes when he could. In fact, he used to like to say, I didn't get their endorsement, but I got their votes. A man from Walker County, from Jasper, was actually the technical Klan endorsee in 1926 when the judge was first elected to the Senate.
Right. How long did you clerk with him?
3 terms, not quite 3 years, 2.5 years, something like that.
And after that, did you come back to Birmingham?
I came back to Birmingham as acting regional attorney for the Wage Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor. The minimum wage hour bill had just become law. And I was one of those, we were, in my office, we were that bunch of communists who were trying to get the minimum wage, the average wage in the textile industry, for instance, in this area, up from 10 cents an hour to 25 cents.
That was communistic, I would say.
Oh, yeah, we were destroying the country and all the underpinnings.
Well, upon your return and you becoming then a labor lawyer, you obviously started to have relationship with people who were looking at labor, but also race. And I know that in 1946, you were part of a group that started a religious and labor fellowship. Can you tell me something about how that all came about?
Well, that was set up by Phil Murray, who was president of the Steelworkers and the CIO at that time, who was dedicated to the principles that the CIO and the United Mine Workers had professed. That is, to represent all people without discrimination of any kind based on race, creed, or national origin. And this was to be one of the stepping stones, I guess, that Phil had in mind. And so he sent this fellow, John Ramsey, here, who, a very nice man. He was white, and he was a lay leader in the Presbyterian church, I think, or I think that's what it was. And he came here and got this group together of union officers and ministers, a small group, maybe 20 or 30 people. I don't know, I wish I could remember their names. I can't. One was a lovely man named Ware, who was a young black minister.
Reverend Ware?
Reverend Ware, and he and I became good friends. And he later was in the CAC committee. Mm-hmm. And he was a militant in a decent, persuasive sort of way. You know, people loved him, I think. But anyway, we had luncheon meetings, and we met. I remember meeting at the Redmont Hotel, and I can't remember whether we.
Now, wasn't it against the law for blacks and whites to meet together in 46? Indeed. Well, how did you carry that off?
Well, we kind of sneaked in, and evidently there was a sympathetic manager of the Redmont who was cooperative. I can't recall exactly how that happened. But we met a time or two, and we had lunch, and we either were in the basement or in a separate room somewhere where they kept it invisible to the public that we were segregating together. Here's that thing you read says. And after we met a time or two like that, someone said, "We call ourselves a religion and labor fellowship, but we never meet in a religious atmosphere. We meet in this basement or this room in the hotel. Why don't we meet in some place that has some connection with religion?" And we all agreed that would be a good thing to do. And so we went around the table to see how we could do it. Well, 2 or 3 of them said, "Gosh, I would like to do it at my church." But I had to be honest about it. I think it would cause all kind of commotion. And I said, "I know I can't get permission to do it at my temple. That's disgraceful, but I can't do it. I'm not much influence there anyway on anything." But so there was a lovely young Episcopal minister named Mormion. I can't remember his first name. Dr. Mormion. He must have had a doctorate. And he was at St. Mary's on the Highlands Episcopal Church. I think that's the correct name. That's an old, established, fashionable church. A lot of socially prominent people and business prominent people there. He said, "We'll have our next weekly or monthly," I think we met monthly, meeting at my church. Well, it was revolutionary, but it sounded good. So we met there, and we met in the rectory or whatever that side building is, and we sat at a table or tables, and the white ladies of the sisterhood served us, and the air was electric. I mean, they walked in like automatons, and they were polite, and they served us, and nobody said a word. And I guess Dr. Morgan said grace. I don't remember.
It's a group about 50-50, black and white.
My best recollection, we tried to make it that way.
What kind of issues did you deal with?
Well, we dealt with complaints in the mills and the mines. What can we do to improve the seniority situation? Of course, it was easy for the mine workers. They never had the variety of jobs that we had in the steel mills. But John Ramsey would talk about spreading the feeling of brotherhood. I mean, after all, a union is a brotherhood. And I can't give you any real agendas.
Many of the unions at that time, of course, were segregated unions.
They were all the building trades were just about.
All the FFL,
Yeah,
basically.
the old building.
CIO was sort of on the threshold with the Southern organizing drive and bringing black organizers in.
But the steel workers, by 1946 and 7, when this was done, they had organized the basic steel industry. And while there were complaints still that the minorities, blacks and women, there were a few women, some women who'd gotten in during the war when there was a manpower shortage, they were in the union and they were receiving benefits. They got the same insurance, the same vacations, and the same rates of pay for a given job. But the problem was that the top jobs were almost universally white jobs, and they were actually separate lines of promotion. It was the policy of the steelworkers to merge those lines of promotion, and we did. We didn't get it really going too well until I think it was President Truman issued an executive order which prohibited contracts with employers who discriminated on the basis of race or religion and so forth. So that gave us some legal status to move with, and we did. We began merging. When Martin Luther King came to Birmingham, I think Mr. Shuttlesworth had persuaded him to come here. I'm not sure if I'm correct about that, but he was somewhere else.
Right. And
he came here, and out of that eventuated these crowds of students.
Yeah. Well, before we get there, buddy, I'd like for you to just talk briefly about a couple of people.
Sure.
You knew Bill Mitch.
Senior?
Yes.
Oh, yes. He's the father of my partner for 40 years.
Tell me about him as a person.
Well, he came here. He was a union man. He was one of John L. Lewis's arms, and his job was to organize the coal mines. And he organized people, whoever they were, men, women, communists, white, black, in the Mine Workers Union. And he really laid the foundation for what came about in the CIO later on. I'm not too sure about my history, but in the early strikes in the coal mines in the 20s, seems like to me I recall that the employers brought in strike breakers, most of whom were black, from the fields. And they were pretty good jobs to a man who made 50 cents a day to make $2 a day, I guess. But Mr. Mitch was a brave man, big man physically, and he just told them that there wasn't going to be any Ku Klux Klan in the mine workers, that the Constitution forbade it, and he was going to organize people all on the same. He was a great influence, and he was so impeccably honest. There were no issues about it. He didn't publish any books, you know, and make $1 million off of it. He just got the job done.
Right.
He was a great man.
About Howard Strevel.
Howard was a younger Bill Mitch. I mean, he took over. It was his job. He was sent here to answer the complaints that many blacks were making, that seniority was still discriminatory and needed to be cleared up. And Howard started out doing that, merging the lines of promotion, getting threatened over the phone call, getting me threatened over the phone at night, having people call and say, "We know where you are." You know, that's not a very pleasant experience. "We know where you are, you so-and-so, and we're coming out there tonight." Well, Strevel was a great big fellow. He didn't scare very easily.
Well, you were surrounded by a lot of great big fellows.
That's right. I was very pleased to have him.
What about Asbury Howard?
Well, Asbury, unfortunately, my relations with him sort of broke off after that. See, I got to know him when the mine mill union was a going union here, a big union, and an important part of the CIO. It wasn't until 3 or 4 years after that this warfare broke out between the steel workers and the smelter workers, and Asbury was chose the side of mine mill. I was the lawyer for the steel workers.
Yeah, he was one of
but we were still friends.
Yeah, he was one of the original organizers for mine mill in the 30s.
I think so, right. A strange thing, you know, a fellow was, Travis, I think was his name, the president of mine mill, was badly beaten up in the course of that campaign in a fight.
He was the president. He was I believe on the board of directors, Maurice Travis.
I believe he got to be, well, whoever he was. I think
they had a big fight.
They had a big fight out there in the ring. He lost an eye, and he, after the election was over, he filed a lawsuit, or his lawyers did, against the steelworkers for his damages that he suffered in that fight, and maybe other things too, but I remember that. And we represented the steelworkers in that, and I negotiated a settlement. I mean, I, if I do say so, I told the steelworkers, we can't defend that sort of thing, and the man's been hurt, he shouldn't have been, and he should be paid, and they paid him. Right. Now, I don't remember what it was.
Yes. Asbury Howard.
Well, Asbury came to see me at that time, together with, I don't know whether Travis came with him. I think it was Cliff Durr was representing him then, and the fellow that later became an assistant general counsel of the steelworkers. Can't recall his name at the moment. He had been in the labor board years before. The three of them came to me to discuss settlement of that case. And I remember Asbury didn't have much to say, but I think he was probably negotiating at that time to get himself on the staff of the steelworkers. Yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there was an effort by the steelworkers to get the former mine mill officialdom and their followers to join the steelworkers, and there were many that did, because Asbury would eventually become an official with the steelworkers.
That's right. But what I remember is in that meeting in my office, he didn't say very much. Asbury didn't say very much, but when they got up to leave, we shook hands and I told him goodbye. He was the last one to shake hands with me, and he handed me a piece of paper. And it said something like, "I want to talk to you," or "I'd like to talk to you." And whether we ever talked again or not, I don't recall. But I think he and I remained friends, even though.
He was attacked in the Bessemer courthouse, I believe.
But I think it was right outside the courthouse on the sidewalk where I think the registrars was sitting, as I recall, and Asbury was leading a small group, 5 or 6 or 7 blacks, in to register. And they were told, I don't know really, I have no first-hand information, but evidently they were told they couldn't go in, and they tried to go in or something, and the cops just beat them.
Right.
Beat him
He and
down.
his son and some other
There
people
was,
as well.
it was several people. I don't remember. You know.
Now, in 1956, the state of Alabama outlawed the operation of the NAACP here in Alabama. And as a result of that, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights was organized, Fred Shuttlesworth. And between 56 and 63, the movement, Alabama Christian Movement, was involved in a number of different efforts to change the status quo. 57, Fred and his wife attempted to, in fact, enroll their children in Phillips High School.
Oh yeah, there's a picture of Mr. Shuttlesworth leading his little girl, or I think it was a little girl, holding her hand up at Phillips High School, and on each sides of the steps there were these leering fellas with their sticks. I don't know, they had ball bats or something. And that picture reminded me of a picture that appeared in the New York Times, I think it was, in but it was before we got in the war, so it was 1940, I guess, or something. And it showed a young Jewish couple, husband and wife, leading their little girl somewhere, I mean, not to school, too, but anyway, and it was just like that picture. And on the sides were mobs of people, stormtroopers and ordinary civilians, just laughing and having fun, seeing this little child frightened to death, you know. And I thought of how universal these hatreds are.
Senselessness.
Yeah, that's
yes.
right. You can't distinguish them.
Right. Now, in 1963, when the SCLC was invited by Fred Shuttlesworth and the movement to come to Birmingham and to assist in changing the status quo between April 1 and...
What year was this now?
This is in 63.
63, let's see.
Yes.
And the civil rights law was 64.
Right.
So this was a year before that. And it didn't become effective till 65, did it? It was passed in 64.
Passed in 64.
In 64.
But during this time, of course, there were many marches and many people were incarcerated, placed in jail. Children, thousands.
School kids.
And I know that you played some role in helping to facilitate bail money for these children. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, that, as I may say, I'm not turf tending here today because I consider myself only, as Mr. Colonel likes to refer to, as a foot soldier in all this. But while Martin Luther King and this group of merchants were meeting here, the demonstrations, these crowds of school kids kind of swept through downtown, through the stores. I was working downtown. I don't remember too much about it, but I should have. But Howard Strevel was in the midst of combining lines of promotion out at Fairfield, and he and Mr. Farr the director was standing there in the window of their office, and they could see this great group of kids coming up the street or up the sidewalk. And Mr. Farr said to Howard, we're halfway through this, but you think we ought to slow up a little while to some of this?
Who was Mr. Farr?
He was the
Reuben
district
Farr.
director of the steelworkers at that time. Howard was his assistant. And Howard said, hell, Mr. Farr said, we're up to our ears in it now. We're going ahead and we'll just finish it now. So while there was this great conflict between the merchants and their people, we we were trying hard to get the job done where it really counted. Well, anyway, Martin Luther King told these, in the meantime, Bull arrested a whole bunch of kids. I don't remember, it could have been several hundred. I don't remember the numbers, but the jail was full and they had them corralled somewhere out at Fair Park or someplace. And I got a phone call, and I want to tell this very accurately because I've told it a time or two, and I try not to. I think I make some of my experiences sound a little bit too good, maybe, but this, about somewhere late at night, 11 or 12 o'clock, my phone rang, and it was the general counsel of the Steelworkers Union, David Feller. Arthur Goldberg had then gone to be the Secretary of Labor. And Davy, we called him, said to me, Buddy, said, President Kennedy has had Bobby, that was the Attorney General, contact Walter Reuther and Dave McDonald to put up the bond to get these kids out of jail in Birmingham. Now, the background of that is that the city, it used to cost a minimal amount to appeal a case from the city court to the circuit court. I don't remember, it was just a few dollars. They had passed some sort of ordinance to raise the bond money to appeal, costs to appeal a nuisance or interference with passage or whatever they've charged these kids with, probably with illegal congregating or something. They passed an ordinance of some kind that raised the charge, the bond, to something like $2,500 each, as I remember. Anyway, it was a total of over $200,000 that they wanted. It seems like to me it was $240,000. And the president has asked the steel workers, the AFL-CIO and the auto workers to put up that money. And I said, but Dave, I don't know whether we legally can do this. Is trust money that the unions own. And I said, surely if a group of union members get arrested because they're doing something as members of the Klan, he said, we're not going to put up money for them. He said, well, maybe not, but he says, the president wants this done. And I said, well, then we'll do it. But I have to clear it with Mr. Farr, the director, and Howard Strevel. So I called them in the middle of the night, got them up, gave them this outline. I said, we've got to do it. The president wants us. He thinks the interests of the country requires it, and I think it does. And I said, of course, all three of us got to recognize as soon as this word gets out, we'll be looking for a job. And they said, we know that, but this, if the president says this is what's required, then this is what we'll do. So I said, okay, I'll pass the word. So I called Davy back, told him it would be done. And he said, well, I forget now how mechanically they transmitted the money. I think they did it by telegraph or something. Anyway, there were only 3 people that knew where the money was. It was a fellow named Smith, and I can't recall his first name, a young lawyer who was sort of representing these merchants, and the president of Birmingham Trust Bank then, who was later went from here to Montgomery. I've got his name somewhere, but I can't remember. Anyway, he was going to open some kind of special account to segregate this money in and pay it into the court registry. And I can't remember, I don't think they sent the money to me, but they sent me some kind of a wire. And I took it up to this Smith boy's office, and I said, now, the money is here, and we 3, you and this banker and I, are the only ones who know about this, or know how it's being handled. I'm sure others knew about it. And we are the ones who will catch the hell for it, and so welcome. And I didn't hear any more about that for a good while, because Smith or somebody took the money up to the city court, registry of the city court, and put it on deposit with him. And the kids got out because, and I had to tell fella this. I had to tell Mr. Farr and Howard this. Fella had said that Martin Luther King says if those kids are not out by, I don't remember the time, tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock or noon or something, the demonstrations and everything are going to start all again. So, it was something that had to be done immediately. It was a decent thing to do. I'm very glad to have been a small part of it. I won't say that I wasn't nervous.
That would not have been a popular thing to do at the time.
It would have been horrible.
There was another situation also with when Wallace stood in the door with the steelworkers being involved in one way or another. Can you tell me that story?
I can't remember who was trying to get into Alabama. Was it Martha? Was it Lucy?
No, this was after Lucy. This was
after Lucy?
Vivian Malone, I believe.
Well, anyway, it was when one of those cases where some black lady was going to register or something, and and Wallace had said he was going to stand in the door and prevent it. And the Attorney General and the federal government had was dispatching a body of troops down there. We had General Henry Graham showed up, and Wallace postured out there a minute or two in the doorway, But before that, what you're asking about, I think, is Ace Trammell, who was then, I believe he was secretary of the AFL-CIO at that time, state AF, and he got later to be. Ace had called me, and it had the president or the lawyer for the rubber workers call me, I think. But what they wanted, it was the boy who was Assistant United States Attorney General for Civil Rights.
We'll figure his name out.
I'll figure it out in a minute. He had been counsel for IBM before he took this job, and later he became counsel for IBM. And he called me, along with Whizzer White, who later he was some kind of attorney general, assistant attorney general at that time, later went on the Supreme Court. And what they wanted to know was if there wasn't if we could get some white Union people who would mingle out in the crowd and keep the Klan or anybody who got out of line quiet. They didn't want anything to happen, is really what they wanted. And they had to be big boys and those who were committed to our philosophy that were willing to do it. And Ace said, yeah, I'll do it, and I can get, Ace was a pretty big boy in those days, so I can get 2 or 3 other fellows from the local union there. I think it was the Rubber Workers local union in Tuscaloosa, which had a lot of Klan influence in it, unfortunately. But these 3 or 4 guys were out in the mob, and their assignment, as I understood, was if you see anybody getting too loud, quiet them down. Don't let anything happen. And nothing did happen. And General Graham marched up the steps to the governor, gave him a smart salute and said, "Step aside, Governor." And he stepped aside. Well, the thing that I can't remember too well is whether I was there or whether I heard this and talked about it so many times that I think I was there. But I believe I was, because someone told me in this movie that was created in the last year or so that won all the prizes about the fella going to Washington. What is that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Some movie, some very popular movie.
And you appeared in the movie?
I think I'm in that movie now. I may be just imagining things, but I'm almost sure I was.
Yeah.
But anyway, that thing went off without a hitch, you remember. She did register. The Wallace backed down, and the troops didn't have to do anything.
Right. How would you characterize Wallace and Bull Connor during that period?
Well, Wallace was a good deal smarter than Bull Connor. Bull Connor was a rather stupid fellow, I think, in many respects. Wallace was a bright guy. The tragedy is that his brightness and his intellect and his capacity to control people were not directed in the right directions. He made the wrong choice. I think it's the great tragedy, one of the great tragedies of our lifetimes. Like I said earlier to you, if he'd have just come out and said, look, folks, the Supreme Court has acted, we are law-abiding people, I'm your governor, I'm telling you, it's tough, I know it's a difficult thing to do.
You think that would have made a big difference?
I think the people had done what he said. Of course it would have made a big difference. Just as if he was so popular, you remember. Just if Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, as president, if he'd have come out and said the Supreme Court's acted, now let's don't have any trouble here, let's get the schools integrated and go on about building our country and building our communities, it would have gone like a charm. Instead, he went around grumbling and growling about what the Supreme Court was doing until he had to do something, and then he acted the way a general acts. He sends in the troops. So instead of having a solution, we had 30 years of warfare. But those are two tragic things. Those two men had power, had control over people's minds.
Do you think Bull Connor had the same kind of power
No, I don't
and control?
think so. No, Bull Connor, I've heard big businessmen in Birmingham during his heyday, like, who was it I was thinking about? Mervyn Stern, for instance, who was a good man in many respects, but he was in the white leadership that wanted things to remain as they were, white.
Yep.
I heard him say once in a group, I don't remember what brought it out, that Bull's he's a crude sort of fellow, but he's honest, which to me is absurd. What was he honest about? He was an honest racist. I mean, he believed that he was the master. And but anyway, that episode, I think, I want people to remember that when they're told about these, when they read this stuff the Chamber of Commerce has put out at times, and that Newt Gingrich and others put out about the labor unions and and their wildness and unreasonable attitude about it. Remember, I think in that one incident, if they didn't save Birmingham, they certainly preserved it a long time before it would have otherwise been preserved. I mean, it took, they not only, they put their jobs on the line, they put their well-being on the line, they put their family, they shot through Howard Strevel's house. His wife and kid were in there. My wife and kid were sleeping in the back room when I had the guy on the phone telling me they were on their way to bomb my house. That was a very unhealthy feeling.
Buddy, I'm sure that we could go on for another 2 days with the stories that you have about this particular period, and maybe we'll do that another 2 days.
You don't have to.
Is there any other thing that we have not touched base on that you just can't hold that you would like to? We have another 5 minutes or so.
Well, this is a little bit of turf tending, I guess. You know, early the Supreme Court held that a labor union that had collective bargaining rights had to represent all the members of the unit fairly, without regard to race. That was Steele case, Steele against the L&N Railroad. That came out of Birmingham, and it went to the circuit court, dismissed the case on the pleadings, and
what was that, 50, 51?
Somewhere in there. No, it was before that. It was before the war. It was
before the war.
I think it was before the war. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they reversed But nothing ever happened. I don't know what happened to that case. And when we were trying the GM&O case and the Central of Georgia cases, which were based on the same thing, Hugo and I filed that in 1950, filed those two cases. We won job rights back for some hundreds of elderly black firemen who had been firemen on the diesels, on the coal burners, and when the diesels came in, they gave that seniority all to promotables who were whites, you see. In the middle of that trial, and our decision, the decision we got in that case, and it was affirmed, was the first actual judgment, certainly in this area, and possibly in the court, in the country, where those rights which the Supreme Court had declared were actually implemented in concrete terms. That was, what's that fellow's name against GM&O and Jones against Central of Georgia. I wrote that down because I knew I'd forget it. Mitchell against the GM&O.
Okay.
He was one of the few young black firemen. He was our principal witness in that case, and we tried it, and that was when we tried it in the federal court, and it was in the wintertime, I think, and it'd be dark before we'd come out sometimes, and we'd be out there, and I'd have 2 or 3 of these big white steel workers to meet me.
So you obviously in the thick of things, and I want to.
We tried to be.
Well, thank you for taking the time out today out of your
thank
busy
you for,
schedule.
Thank you for. I've got more time than money these days. I've found in these golden years. I'm not physically able to keep up the pace I did, but I have resented the fact that they have nowhere publicized the fact that these 3 labor unions got these kids out and enabled the negotiations to go on. It gave Martin Luther King an honorable basis for talking further, and I think in a real sense contributed to saving Birmingham.
Well, you're now on record. Straightening the record out, clearing the record up.
Don't you think it's strange? I mean, I've asked Bob Calvert at ONB, I said, now, on this breakfast program, it's fine to talk about the merchants who negotiated this thing. I'm all for them. They didn't put up any money, but they did negotiate it. But the people that put up the money ought to be recognized.
Yeah. So Operation New Birmingham basically is dealing with the merchants rather than with labor.
Well, I joined Operation New Birmingham on the commitment from the business manager of the Birmingham News, who's who was
Jacobson?
No, before Jacobson. Vincent Townsend.
Okay.
I told Vincent, I said, I have a lot of friends in the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of fine people, and they do a lot of good things, but they're so politically opposed to me. I can't be a member of that. And I have to oppose them so many times. And he said, well, now, ONB is not going to be, it's separate from the Chamber. And on that commitment, I became a member of it and set up this CAC committee. He asked me to, and I set it up along with Albert Smith. And
CAC?
That's the Community Affairs Committee.
Okay.
That's where we got Cecil Bauer and the president of the school, whose name we couldn't think of, and I can't think of it again. What was his name? You got as bad as I am.
Yeah, when you get over 50, buddy, you can't remember anything.
Well, wait till you get over 80. Then, not Curry. That's troubling. Well, anyway.
Well,
the 2 of them really made the Community Affairs Committee, got us off the ground.
Okay.
And Vincent Townsend is entitled to a great deal of credit for it.
Sure.
Vincent and I used to break many a sword. When he was coming up, he was a scrapper.
Okay.
And he stepped up on a lot of people's backs getting up there. But when he got up there, he wanted to use his power to aid this community to be a better place.
Buddy,
it
you
did.
obviously have played a tremendous role, and again, I appreciate the
Well-
role that you played, and I appreciate you spending your time. And
Well, my
we'll
time
try to
is-
do this again
I hope we
at some
can.
later date.
I hope we can. Now, I don't. You will deal with this matter.
Yes,
as
I will.
appropriately.
Yes, I will.
I'm not. I don't think I could have anything to do with trying to get that printed.
Okay, no
because
problem at all. Again, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for asking me, and I hope I can come again. I want to tell you and these good people here that it's very proud. It's a matter of great pride to me that, as the old baseball players say, the shadows lengthened and got the infield pulled in, that my name is on the board of directors of this great place. I'm very proud of
We
that.
appreciate the role that you're playing there as well,
I-
buddy.
And I thank whoever put me there.